You know, you watch a show like Bluey and you don't think that some dude was sitting in a park recording all those sounds that you've heard, you know? And, you know, like that doesn't exist in any sound effects libraries. As the bandit's walking on the court, he's just sort of hitting it like that. It's not the easiest way and the most time-efficient way to get the sound sometimes, but it's the most fun way. I mean, that's the sound of our childhood, that sound. Never in your wildest dreams would you imagine you've helped create the biggest show in the world.
In many ways, Bluey is a family affair. The series was created by Joe Brumm. His brother Dan Brumm sound designs and mixes the show.
Yes, I'll take you on a quick little drive.
Unlike other cartoons, Bluey is set in a real place, Brisbane, Australia, where Dan and Joe grew up.
See, like that's classic kind of healer house, that white one. That's a Queenslander, you know, the sort of the weatherboards and raised up on stilts so you get a nice sort of airflow.
And so you'd say this would be kind of the healer neighborhood?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful, iconic suburb. Very high real estate prices as a result of that.
How did Bandit afford it?
Yeah, a lot of money in archaeology, you'd think, and airport security. So this is where the episode Squash was set. It was set here because this is where I used to play squash with Joe, my brother, the director of Bluey, and my other brother. I said, you should make an episode about squash, about the brothers playing each other. And he kind of took that simple idea and turned it into the phenomenal story that that episode has.
So it begins!
This is the pathway they're walking up at the start of the episode with the kids on their shoulders. You'll notice with the glass windows that you can see Taylor Range Mountain and the beautiful trees in the background. So you've got to kind of come up with a hybrid background atmos that's the sound of a squash court, which we'll hear in a second is so particular, but also has the fact that it's in the suburbs sort of baked into it with a few little distant bird sounds and things like that. I just carry this around with me nearly everywhere and I'd chuck it on my car seat and it just allowed me to really quickly record a sound so I wouldn't miss things. And 154 episodes of Bluey, week in, week out. This thing just caught punishment in local creeks, squash courts, plug in mics to it sometimes, but often just a stereo mic. If you just sort of treat it a little bit with EQ, it sounds amazing. There's much more complicated mic handheld systems you can use, but I like this because it was just quick, easy, and nondescript. So you notice up here, this is the kind of little alcoves where Bluey and Bingo are sitting as their dad and uncle are playing squash in there.
I mean, this looks animated.
Yeah, that's the thing about the visuals of Bluey. Like, it's such a beautiful town, Brisbane. Squash is such a particular sounding game. Like, you don't have libraries of squash. So I knew I had to come to a squash court and record every element of the game to make it sound as realistic as possible. Everything about a squash court, it's this massive, big concrete room that just has seconds and seconds of reverb and delay. So every sound just has this huge decay to it. The sound of these glass doors, you know, they've got a real sort of good impact to it. When I'd play squash with my brothers, it's a different game to squash with friends because you're trying not to hurt them. But with your brothers, it's kind of like combat squash where you don't care. So it's a really quite a wild game and you're slamming into walls and that kind of thing. So, and that's what happens in the episode. So it's that awesome kind of glass. And so you'd hurt your shoulder from time to time because you'd have your mic and you'd have to kind of, you know, slam into it. And like that sound is great as a layer sometimes. Sometimes it's not quite funny enough in the episode, so you'd put other elements, but you'd have that as a base. Or the walls, as the bandit's walking on the court, he's just sort of hitting it like that. You know, I can record that and I probably did in my studio. But this sound, you know, it's got such a particular sound to it. So I'd set a mic up against that wall and I'd hit a bunch of balls against the wall. And by setup, I mean I would grab one of the bins and just put my little H5 on top of the bin. Like it's run and gun, the way I would do the sound. And then you capture all the other little elements, like as you're running, the kind of...
That squeak.
Yeah, even though the characters don't wear shoes, if you don't hear that squeak, it just doesn't feel like a game of squash. Yeah, I'll take you over this way. So yeah, this is the bubbler that Stripe goes out to get a drink.
Just because I have to drink from this.
Yes.
I've made it. I'm all the way around the world.
Don't put your tongue on the metal. That's the one rule.
That's a solid one. Yeah,
Yeah,
real
yeah.
cold.
That'll do you after game of squash. I'll take you on a little detour. Welcome to Folklore Sound, beautiful sound studios, and where I produced the second and third season of Bluey, the sound design in their Studio 2 down here, which is probably my favourite studio I've ever been to. I used to have a whole shelf of kids' toys and props and wooden blocks, and I'd set a mic up here and I could kind of record myself dropping things on a wooden floor. And that was invaluable because it's such a particular sound, you know. Complex but simple is probably how I describe the sound for this show. It's not Star Wars, it's not hardcore sci-fi, but simple sounds can sometimes be the most challenging because you've got nowhere to hide with simple sounds, you know. Footsteps are so fundamental to the storytelling and jokes in Bluey because a lot of jokes are punctuated on the speed of the kids just hurtling through the rooms. And in a Queenslander, these traditional Queensland homes with wooden floorboards sitting high up, it sounds like a pack of wild horses running through your hallway kind of thing. It's boring and it's frame by frame, but it's something you've just really got to sort of spend some time getting right. So I'll take you through some of the episode, like, you know, we talked about it out on the squash courts, but this episode in particular, set in a squash court, every single sound, including voices, are just awash in reverb. And you have to find a balance. You can't wash a voice out with too much reverb for an animated show because you'll just lose all its clarity. So you fictionalize that sort of aspect a little, but the actual squash sounds themselves, if they didn't have that reverb, they'd sound too dry and wouldn't feel like a game of squash, which is why I went to a squash court and recorded them and used their actual kind of real world sound.
As someone who just experienced the real thing, thanks to you, that sounds great.
Yeah, thank you.
It sounds so clean.
Yeah, I was stoked. Like, it's, you know, like you cut something and you're like, it just feels like a game of squash all of a sudden, and it's intense and it's loud. To build that, a whole bunch of layers. So these are the racket hits. Front, bouncing off the front wall. So you can just hear that reverb recorded live, you know. I probably would have sent it to some reverbs as well, I think, to double up, but because you can only sort of capture so much tail before the ball bounces back and creates another transient, which you can't sort of cut out. And the whooshes of the rackets. Bouncing off the floor.
It sounds so clean.
Yeah, and then squeaks to the floor. And Stripe hitting the ground here.
Wow. That sounds so clean.
And so, you know, it's such a fast-moving thing, squash. So there's a lot of editing in there. This little scene here, this is where Stripe has come back with a new attitude on life thanks to Bingo, and he's fired up and he's going to finally try and beat his big brother. So the sound design had to kind of depart from the real world game of squash and just be a bit more stylized to show that he's got almost these like superpowers all of a sudden.
There, I fixed you.
Yeah, Bingo. You did.
Whoops.
Huh?
Oh, yeah.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! Yeah!
Out in the wild, when people find out I voice Stripe, they say, "Can you do the Stripe voice?" And it's kind of like, well, this is the Stripe voice, you know?
Take that! Oh!
And it's a true story. Like, I used to play my brother Joe, who directed the show, all the time in squash. And he's my middle brother, a little bit older than me. He just always would win. I just could never beat him, except for this one time. Like this one time I beat him, and I stripe level celebration where I got down on hands and knees and was kind of like screaming to the sky. So I think that's kind of what the episode is based around, that moment. Sometimes little brothers do beat big brothers. This park is like Watonga Park, and it's kind of where a lot of visual Bluey episodes were based. And in the early days, I guess my philosophy behind the sound of the show was I wanted it to sound as realistic and sort of authentic as the stories were. And so an episode set in a park and a playground like this, it's like you don't really have those sounds necessarily in your libraries in the studio, but you can't get them wrong, because every kid plays in these things and they know what the sound of a monkey bar is, or they know what the sound of a slide is. So if you get that wrong, it's like it just pulls people out of the narrative. So the thing I'd love to do was just kind of come down here on one of my days working on the show and just record a bunch of the things that are in the episode. The sound of, like that doesn't exist in any sound effects libraries. And then, these little monkey bars. Every kid who's done monkey bars knows the sort of the slide of the hands.
Monkey bars!
Then you got these things. What a cool rattle sound, right? Like what a cool sort of metal squeak sound. You look pretty weird when there's kids at the park. You're just an adult standing, pointing a microphone at one of these things, kind of playing with it.
You won't get us today, Beach Troll.
One of the first episodes that featured in this park was Wagon Ride, which we talked about in the podcast, where the actual red wagon that Dad pushes his kids in,
Oh, finally.
that was my brother's wagon, and he would push his kids in that. So I went, well, I better borrow that wagon and record myself kind of pushing it around. But it's really light if you're just pushing it on itself, so you need the sound of it weighted down. So I took my two little young girls at that point, they were like 2 and 4, I think, and we went wagon riding through the park here, and I recorded the whole thing. And every time I've come to this park since, like 7, 8, 9 years ago now, you remember those moments, because it's like you were working on this great show that you knew by that point, I think this show's going to be a big deal. You didn't quite know. But now obviously it's this phenomenon kind of thing. And to think that you just kind of recorded little bits and pieces around this park, it's pretty special to me, this place. This was where the episode Pirates was set, with the hammock swing.
One day, there were 3 pirates.
Brave pirates.
And that's my first step, is go, right, what sounds in this episode have I got in my library and can record in the studio, and what sounds can't I? Like, that's such a particular sound, and it tells such a great story. It's not the easiest way and the most time-efficient way to get the sound sometimes, but it's the most fun way. Brisbane's such a pretty city and such a beautiful sounding city. And so I'd come down to parks like this with my little H5 and just record a stereo image of times a day when the episode was set. I think the problem I got into sometimes is it sounds too unrealistic. Like a show that's set in the suburbs, I'd have a real recording from out the front of my house, but it sounded like you're in an aviary or a jungle or something like that. There's too many birds. Like, well, that's kind of what Brisbane sounds like. So you had to kind of filter some things down and make it slightly unrealistic to make it seem more realistic. For the episode Cafe, where they go down the big enclosed slide, I got up to the top of this massive slide and I kind of waited for the kid to go down, and then I went down. And it's the most awkward thing because you're spinning around. I was 40 with a microphone that I'm trying not to break, going down this thing.
Down here.
And you come out of the bottom of it, right at the foot of this granddad. And you could just tell he's kind of looking at you going, what are you doing? Get a real job. I knew my brother was going to make a good show. I would see the scripts well and truly before I started production. And I remember reading the script for Cricket and it just blew me away. Like, you could tell this was going to be a big episode.
Do people know that this is the iconic Bluey Park?
Not many people, I don't think. So if you see here, they're the toilets.
Yeah, which is right over there.
Yeah, right over there. Then you got the house. Stripe hits the ball onto the roof of over there.
Wow.
So I saw that. So, well, it's a tin roof. So the sound of a tennis ball hitting a tin roof. Every kid knows that.
6 and out. Oh, man.
So I recorded the sound of a tennis ball on a tin roof. But that's there. Then you got over here a little pergola, which I guess that's over there. And then the cricket pitch itself is here.
Wow.
And you got the bike track, which is, over here. So, there's cricket with cricket bats and cricket balls. And then there's Brisbane or Australian park cricket, which typically are played with these plastic bats. We used to call them Kanga cricket bats, or beach cricket bats. And they're kind of hollow and plastic. And they've got their own sound. And that sound doesn't exist in any sound effects libraries, but it exists in the head of every single Australian kid who grew up playing park cricket or backyard cricket with one of these bats. So you can't record that in the studio because you need the impact and the decay of the sound. And so I came down here with a little microphone, which I set up, a little tennis ball, and just recorded myself kind of belting a few shots. Because you'll hear, it's such a lovely little sound that's kind of just one of a kind.
I'm so excited. That's the first time I've ever heard it with my own ears.
Yes, that's the sound of our childhood, that sound. And so then you have an actual cricket bat. Again, a totally different sound, but every kid in Australia knows the sound of hitting a tennis ball with a cricket bat. So you can't get that wrong, otherwise that entire episode just falls flat. All right, so this is the episode Cricket. This is Watonga Park where we just were. First thing I do is just kind of create a little bed of atmospheres, which is sort of a mix of atmospheres I've recorded around town as well as some other just Australian stuff to kind of fill it out. So there's like a nice layer of sort of, just distant kind of traffic, suburban air noise, which I always like that. It can be a bit ugly in the mix sometimes, but I like it just to fill things out a little. Then just various bird layers.
It sounds like what I remember out in the field.
Yeah, well, there literally is a layer here that would have been recorded out in the field there. This is a more scary scene where Rusty's facing up against a big, older kid bowling an actual cricket ball, so it's a bit scary for him. And it's probably early morning or afternoon based on the light, and so you had to kind of change the sound to suit that, but also sort of lean into the fact that there's a bit of tension in this scene. So there's more kind of, just sounds a little more sparse and a bit less beautiful. So again, I'm breaking the wall there. That's not purely Australian, but I just like the slight creepiness of the insects. You barely would notice it in the mix, but I just like that there's a sense of you're kind of slightly leaning into the tension of the story there.
I love that. Yeah, it's a little dissonant.
A nice little nighttime as Rusty's there. Then it just goes back to this beautiful Brisbane daytime park vibe. They're little details. I spend a lot of time trying to make them sound right. Not many people would notice them in the mix, but it's important, I think. Even if you just hear a couple of birds, it sets the tone and you go, daytime. And just that little story is kind of filled in your mind. Because kids, they might not have paid attention to what their park sounds like, but they know. If it doesn't sound right, they know. And so if you get that kind of thing wrong, you're not acting in the service of the story, because kids will just be a little bit like, this doesn't feel right. They won't maybe know why.
All right, so Dan took me up to the top of Mount Cootha, which is the iconic location of one of the greatest television episodes of all time.
Yeah, it could be. That's where she's standing when Rad jumps over the thing and sees her.
Rad?
And here, the big binoculars.
Wow, it's really wedged.
Now, could a quarter get stuck?
Well,
maybe we fudged it just a little bit.
In an animated film, it definitely could, but certainly one of the most key story aspects of that episode is this thing. And very particular sound as well. So I came up here with a microphone.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I've got things that sound similar in my libraries, but I'd rather know that I recorded the actual things because they're so heavy and swivelly and, you know, they don't quite have the same coin trays. That sound. Like that's an awesome, lovely metal, heavy, chunking kind of sound. And so often you come up in your mind, you're thinking it's going to make all these kind of awesome sounds. And you get up here and it doesn't make all those sounds, but you'll get a layer of it and then you'll embellish it in post-production. But I like that even if I only know that there is a layer of the real Mount Cootha magnifying binocular things.
This is one of the most beautiful views I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, this is where they're all kind of sitting when Chili and Frisky have fairly emotional conversation in the episode. And that's what's great about the show. You have all these really tender, serious moments that are then punctuated by Muffin screaming at the binocular off in the distance. I don't think Joe ever lets you feel the sadness for too long before he interrupts it with some kind of humour, at times anyway. I think that's the genius of the show, you know? You cry, but then you laugh in a second later.
We saved the wedding! Hooray! Come on!
In the first sort of 3 days, just cutting the effects and dialogue, and the episode exists in your mind, purely sound design and voice. And, you know, the story flows great. And then on the 4th day, you'd get Joff's music. And suddenly the episode just comes to life, like emotionally, from a fun point of view, a storytelling point of view, week after week, like episode after episode, just amazing music that transformed this thing which you'd already grown such an attachment to from a sound design point of view and a voices point of view. And suddenly it just, yeah, you're watching a piece of art.
Once upon a time, there was a farmer who owned a horse called Midnight. But one day, Midnight ran away. The farmer's neighbours came over and said, "That's bad luck."
The show's got to sound real, in my opinion, but it's also got to sound like the way a kid hears the world. It's pretty wild to kind of, nowadays when the show's as big as it is, to see it in places and you feel this immense pride that that's something your brother created and you took part in creating, you know? And it's just affected so many lives beneficially all around the world. It's like if you ever get to the privilege to work on something that changes so many lives like that, it's a real honour. I feel quite lucky to have played my little role in the show's production.